We have been talking about the conducting zone, which conducts air into your lungs. So the trachea is part of the conducting zone, as are the bronchi, as are the smaller vessels called bronchioles, until we get into what is called the respiratory zone, and that is the alveoli. So that is actually where gas exchange takes place. So this is where. So let's look at the branching of the bronchial tree. So you'll notice that when we look at the left versus the right lung, one thing that you'll notice is that the right side has 3 lobes, whereas the left side has only 2. So the reason why we use our right hand and place it over our chest like this to the left side is because that, you can feel that, that's where your heart sits. It sits more to the left, so it's not quite symmetrical in your body. So it creates and takes up more space on the left side of your thoracic chamber, right? Your thoracic, I can't think of the word. Anyway, space. And so there's only 2 lobes on the left lung, but there's 3 lobes on the right. Now, notice that the bronchi branch off. That's plural, bronchi. One would be the left bronchus versus the right bronchus. And then they branch into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller vessels. What this is going to do is this is going to lead us into the structure where we have gas exchange and we have very large surface area for gas exchange. So the gas exchange occurs in these structures called the alveoli. So we have this terminal bronchiole, right? And then it goes into respiratory bronchioles, but this is my alveoli. Now, if you were to look at, say, the lungs of a frog, they would not have as much surface area. We have to, as mammals, be super efficient at our respiration because we use oxygen in order to produce energy, in order to maintain our body temperature. So we are endothermic. We have a huge surface area, which is actually good because sometimes we have to do without one lung. You know, you can survive with just one lung, right? Sometimes we have damage to part of the lungs and the rest of the lungs will take over, right? Decrease lung capacity a little bit, but we are able to survive. So these are the air sacs, and they are connected to one another via these alveolar pores. And that is important because we'll talk about like what happens if the alveoli collapses, right? These pores actually help to create a kind of an equal pressure in the alveoli. We don't want the alveoli to collapse because if the lung or the alveoli collapse, then air can't get in there and we can't get oxygen. Okay. So these are the alveoli. This is the respiratory membrane. It's very thin. It's very moist, right? There's a large surface area. So let's go back to the respiratory zone. And this is the alveoli. This is where we have the respiratory membrane, which is actually simple squamous, a single layer of flat cells, epithelium. So if I were to draw, it might look something like this. We have flat cells and a single layer of them. And this is where gas exchange is going to take place. So oxygen moves across that surface. Oops. Oxygen, that's oxygen O2. And CO2 moves out. That says O2 at the bottom there. Okay. CO2 moves out. So this is where gas exchange takes place. So this respiratory membrane must be thin, It must be moist. Why? Because gas cannot diffuse until it is dissolved in water. And there is a very large surface area. So we're going to talk about respiratory physiology, right, and why this is important from a physiological point of view, that surface area. Okay, so let's look at it in a little bit more detail. So here we can see that the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. This is what picks up the oxygen, and this is what gives off the CO2. So the alveoli are highly vascularized. The capillaries exchange, right? So from the air, it actually goes across the membrane and then into the capillaries and then out back to the heart, and then it's pumped back out to the body. So if we were to look at this membrane, you'll see a couple of interesting things about this membrane. One, these are the thin, flat cells, the simple squamous epithelial tissue. These are actually called type 1 alveolar cells. Then we have macrophages. These are phagocytes. So if things do get into your lungs, maybe it's an asbestos fiber, gets into your lungs, passes through all the filtration mechanisms, gets into the lungs, there are macrophages that would go in there and try to break that down and remove it from your body. So those macrophages are important. We also cough up these macrophages when we cough up our mucus. Then we have another type of cell, which is called a type 2 cell, which here is in green. And they are secretory, which means they're producing something like a protein to be secreted to the outside. So let's talk about these alveolar type 1 and type 2 cells. Okay. Oops, that's too thick. Alveolar cells. Type 1. These type 1 are the respiratory membrane. So they're the epithelial cells. Okay. Type 2. These are cells that are secretory cells. So gas exchange doesn't occur across them. They're actually bigger, right? And they secrete a substance that is called surfactant. So what surfactant does is it's kind of like a detergent, I guess. What it does is it actually prevents water molecules from adhering too tightly to each other. So it prevents the surface tension of water molecules on the surface of your very thin membrane. Without surfactant, the water molecules would start to cling to one another, and that clinging of the water molecules would cause the alveoli to collapse. Okay, so let's talk about that. So the function of the surfactant is it prevents water tension on the surface from causing the collapse of the alveoli. Now, why is that even important? If it works, right? So one of the things that happens to premature babies is that sometimes their lungs are not ready. And they're not ready when they're premature because their lungs have not started producing surfactant. So we have what is referred to as a syndrome called the infant respiratory distress syndrome. So this is IRDS. So this occurs in premature babies. So if their alveoli are collapsed, one way that you can get them to open up is you could put them on a ventilator. So positive pressure ventilation, forcing air into the lungs, will open them up. And then you could put in that air that you're putting in, you add synthetic surfactant. So you treat with positive pressure ventilation plus synthetic surfactant. Synthetic means that it's produced outside of the body. Surfactant. And that will prevent the lungs from collapsing. So that's why new premature babies oftentimes have to be on ventilators, because they can't breathe on their own. And they will eventually start producing their own surfactant, and this will go away. So it is just because their lungs aren't ready to be breathing air. So that would be the respiratory zone. The alveoli is where we have the respiratory membrane, and this is where gas exchange between the air and the capillaries, the blood, occurs.